Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're looking at something that I think is really interesting, is the idea of skepticism and how that can be a trauma response in adults, specifically adults who are diagnosed with autism later in life. We've got some fascinating articles and website info to dig into today.
This is a topic that is so important, but unfortunately it often gets overlooked. And it's really crucial to understanding the actual experiences of many autistic adults.
Yeah.
We're not talking about just typical healthy skepticism here, but something much deeper and more ingrained distrust that can have an impact on different aspects of their lives.
Yeah, and it's something that comes up in one of the sources that we're looking at, a blog called Cheap ABA.
Yeah.
They have a bunch of posts about the whole late diagnosis experience, and they highlight the emotional roller coaster. I mean, think about some of these titles like Navigating Your Emotions After Your Child's Diagnosis, or even Recognizing Signs of Autism in Adults. It's a lot to deal with.
It really is. And when you think about the years leading up to that diagnosis, all of the potential for misinterpretations and missed opportunities for support, it makes sense that skepticism might develop as a way to cope. Almost like they're trying to navigate a world where the rules feel like they're constantly changing and they never quite know if they're getting it right.
That's a really powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about all of these social aspects that go along with this. Cheap ABA also digs into this. They have posts about navigating friendships, romantic relationships, even things like workplace dynamics. All of these areas where communication breakdowns and misunderstandings can be so painful.
And those kinds of experiences can be especially challenging for people on the spectrum. Folks who might be more sensitive to social cues or maybe have difficulty interpreting nonverbal communication. Just imagine constantly feeling like you're missing some key piece of information. In every interaction, it can be incredibly frustrating and lead to feeling like you don't belong.
And what happens when those social missteps, as some might call them, what happens when those result in negative feedback, like bullying, isolation, or even misdiagnosis by a professional? It just reinforces this whole idea that the world is confusing and potentially even dangerous. It seems like skepticism becomes this shield.
That is such a great analogy. I mean, one of the articles we have actually describes it that way, skepticism as a protective shield. I think that really captures this whole phenomenon. It's a way for them to create this sense of safety and control in a world that can feel so overwhelming and unpredictable.
So how does this shield actually work in everyday life? What does skepticism look like? How does it manifest in the behavior of adults with autism?
Well, the article breaks it down into three main behaviors: constant questioning, difficulty trusting others, and a heightened state of hypervigilance.
So it's more than just doubting information or being wary of authority figures. It's this deeper distrust that affects all of their interactions, even their relationships.
Exactly. And it makes it much more difficult to connect with other people, to build meaningful relationships, and to just feel like they belong in the world.
It makes you wonder about how this skepticism actually serves them. Is it a totally negative thing? Or could there be some potential benefits to using it as a coping mechanism?
That's a really interesting question. On the one hand, you can say that skepticism might help protect them from being exploited or manipulated, especially in those situations where social cues are unclear or hard to read.
So it's like having this internal alarm system. That goes off whenever something feels wrong,
Yeah.
even if they can't really explain why.
Exactly. And that can actually be pretty helpful in navigating a world that sometimes preys on people who are more trusting or naive.
But if that skepticism is too rigid, then it could actually prevent them from having real connections and experiencing that joy that comes with intimacy and trust.
Absolutely. It's this delicate balance, recognizing that skepticism can help protect them, but also learning to challenge those deeply held beliefs and allowing themselves to be open to the possibility of positive experiences.
And this is where I think the Cheap ABA blog offers some really valuable perspectives. They've got several posts about overcoming skepticism. And one of the things they emphasized that I found really moving was self-compassion.
Self-compassion is so crucial here. It's about recognizing that they developed these coping mechanisms for a reason. They needed to protect themselves, especially when the world didn't always understand or try to meet their needs.
It's about understanding the pain that they went through and validating the experiences that led them to this place of skepticism.
Exactly. And it's only when they can accept themselves that they can truly begin to heal and grow.
So let's talk about some specific strategies for overcoming this skepticism.
Yeah.
What are some things that people can do to chip away at that protective shield and start building relationships that feel more authentic and trusting?
Well, the article talks about the importance of finding support. And that could mean a few different things: joining an online forum or support group, connecting with a therapist who specializes in working with people on the spectrum, or even just confiding in close friends and family who they feel safe with.
It's about finding that sense of community, knowing that you're not alone on this journey.
Exactly. And another really important step is challenging those negative thought patterns. It's about recognizing that inner critic, that voice that's always whispering, "You're not good enough," or "No one will ever understand you." Learning to counter those thoughts with more positive and realistic ones.
So it's not about denying the negative experiences, but trying to reframe them, looking at them with more compassion and understanding.
Exactly. And things like mindfulness and meditation can be so helpful with this because they teach you to observe those thoughts without judgment. And slowly you can start to shift your perspective.
It's about taking back control of your story, defining yourself on your own terms, not letting those past experiences dictate your future.
That's a great way to put it. And the article also talks about the importance of building trust gradually. It's not about forcing yourself to trust everyone right away, which can feel overwhelming and even unsafe. It's about taking baby steps, starting with people who feel safe and supportive, and slowly expanding your circle of trust as you become more comfortable.
So it's like dipping your toe into the water before you jump in head first. Now, speaking of trust, you mentioned earlier that skepticism can actually be a way of protecting yourself from being taken advantage of. But how does that actually work in real-life situations? What are some examples of how skepticism might actually help someone with autism?
Okay, so let's say we have an autistic adult, and in the past they've been taken advantage of. Maybe they fell for a financial scam, or they were in a relationship with someone who is manipulative. They've learned the hard way that not everyone has their best interests at heart, so now when they meet new people, or they come across new opportunities, they're going to be a lot more cautious, more likely to ask questions, and not take things at face value.
So in a way, their skepticism is like a filter, helping them figure out who's genuine and who might be trying to use them.
You got it. It's not about being cynical or mistrusting everyone they meet. It's more about being careful and protecting themselves from potential harm.
And I bet this skepticism can also be helpful in navigating social situations. You know those situations where the rules are unwritten and kind of ambiguous?
Absolutely. Think about something like sarcasm or humor. Autistic individuals often take things very literally, so a sarcastic comment might be interpreted as a real insult. That's where skepticism can help. By giving them a moment to pause, consider the context, and avoid being hurt or offended unnecessarily.
So it's like they have this built-in fact-checking system to help them navigate all those tricky social nuances.
Precisely. And in those situations, skepticism can be really valuable for self-preservation.
So it sounds like skepticism isn't inherently good or bad. It really depends on the context and how it's used. It can be a shield that protects from harm, but can also be a wall that prevents genuine connection.
You hit the nail on the head. It's all about recognizing both sides of skepticism, the protective aspects and the potential drawbacks, and developing those skills to manage it effectively.
And that brings us back to those strategies for overcoming skepticism, which we'll dive into a little bit deeper after a quick word from our sponsors.
Sounds good. Before the break, we were talking about that double-edged sword of skepticism, how it can be both a protective mechanism and a potential barrier to connection.
And I think we were just about to dive into those strategies for overcoming skepticism. Right. It feels like such a delicate balance. How do you encourage someone to be more open and trusting without dismissing or minimizing the very real hurt that might have led them to that skepticism in the first place?
You're right. It's not about erasing those experiences or pretending that they didn't happen. It's more about acknowledging the pain, validating those feelings, and then exploring some new ways of relating to themselves and the world around them.
The Cheap ABA blog talks a lot about seeking support as a really important first step. They use this phrase, finding your tribe, connecting with other people who understand what it's like to live with autism. What are some ways that people can find that kind of support?
Well, there are so many different options these days. Online forums and support groups can be a really good place to start, especially for people who might feel isolated or overwhelmed by face-to-face interactions. There are also autism-specific therapy groups, both online and in person, where people can share their experiences and learn coping strategies from others who get it.
And I imagine having a therapist who specializes in autism can make a world of difference. Someone who really understands the unique challenges and also the strengths that come with being neurodivergent.
Definitely. It's about finding someone who can offer a safe and non-judgmental space to process those experiences, challenge those negative thought patterns, and develop healthier ways of coping with the world.
Speaking of negative thought patterns, Cheap ABA also talks about how important it is to challenge those, especially when you've dealt with years of misunderstanding and judgment. It can be so easy to get stuck in those cycles of self-doubt and criticism. How can someone start to break free from those thought patterns?
Mindfulness and meditation can be really powerful tools for this. They help you to become more aware of your thoughts and feelings. But without getting totally swept away by them, it's almost like creating a space between you and your thoughts so you can observe them without judgment and with a bit more objectivity.
So it's not about being controlled by your thoughts, but choosing which ones you want to engage with and which ones you can just let go.
Exactly. And over time, that can lead to a real shift in perspective and a more compassionate and accepting relationship with yourself.
Self-compassion seems to be a really big theme in the cheap ABA blog. They keep coming back to treating yourself with kindness and understanding, recognizing that this skepticism developed as a way to protect yourself, not as some kind of personal failure.
Right. Self-compassion is absolutely essential here. It's about recognizing that you did the best that you could with the tools you had at the time and letting go of that self-blame, embracing self-acceptance instead.
And from that place of self-acceptance, it becomes so much easier to start challenging those limiting beliefs
Yeah.
and being open to new possibilities.
Exactly. And that's where building trust gradually comes into play. It's about taking small steps, starting with people who feel safe and supportive, and slowly expanding that circle of trust as you get more comfortable.
It's like learning to trust yourself again, believing that you are worthy of love and connection, and that the world can be a good place, even if it hasn't always felt that way.
I love that. And as you start to build those trusting relationships, you might be surprised how much your perspective starts to shift. You might start to realize that the world isn't as scary or unpredictable as you once thought, and that there are people out there who really care about you, and they want to connect with you in a genuine way.
It's like those shields of skepticism slowly start to melt away. And underneath, there's this open and vulnerable heart.
That's a great way to put it. And that vulnerability. While it might feel a little bit scary at first, it's the key to experiencing real intimacy and joy in relationships.
So we've talked about seeking support, challenging negative thoughts, and building trust gradually. Are there any other strategies mentioned in these sources for overcoming skepticism?
Yeah, one that stood out to me was the idea of educating other people about autism. The Cheap ABA blog actually have a whole section on this, and they really highlight the importance of sharing your story, helping people to understand what it's like to experience the world from an autistic perspective.
It's about breaking down all those stereotypes and misconceptions about autism, showing people the diversity and the beauty of neurodiversity.
Exactly. And when you take the time to educate others about autism, you're not just creating more understanding and acceptance for yourself, but you're also paving the way for other people to feel seen and understood as well.
So it's like you're expanding that circle of compassion, one conversation at a time.
I love that. And remember, education doesn't have to be this big formal lecture or anything. It can be as simple as sharing a personal anecdote, explaining how sensory overload feels, or even just correcting someone when they use outdated or offensive language about autism.
It's about meeting people where they are, having those open and honest conversations, and inviting them to see the world through a different lens.
That's it. And the more we can do that, the closer we get to creating a world where skepticism isn't this necessary shield, but a choice.
Okay, this has been super insightful, but I kind of want to shift gears for a minute and talk about the bigger picture. The Cheap ABA blog mentions this concept of the autism tax, and I have to admit I'd never heard of that term before. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to the overall experience of being an adult with autism?
Sure. The autism tax basically refers to all those extra costs, both financial and emotional, that autistic individuals often end up facing, just because the world isn't really designed for them. And these costs can be pretty significant. They can impact everything from employment to relationships to their overall quality of life.
So it's not just about literal money, but the emotional energy it takes to navigate a world that often feels overwhelming or unaccommodating.
Exactly. For example, an autistic adult might have to spend extra money on therapy, sensory tools, or specialized support services. And they might also have trouble finding and keeping a job because of their sensory sensitivities, their communication deficits, or just the difficulty with social interactions in a typical workplace.
That makes sense. And then there's that emotional cost of constantly masking,
Mm-hmm.
trying to fit into a neurotypical world, which can lead to burnout.
It definitely can. Masking takes a huge toll on their mental and emotional well-being. It's like they're always performing, trying to be someone they're not, which can lead to feelings of exhaustion, anxiety, and even depression.
And I would imagine that this autism tax can also impact relationships. Because if you're always feeling overwhelmed or misunderstood, it's got to be hard to connect with other people on a deeper level.
That's a really good point. The social and communication differences that often come with autism can definitely lead to misunderstandings, hurt feelings, and even social isolation. And when you add in the emotional weight of the autism tax, it makes building and maintaining healthy relationships even more challenging.
So it's like this multi-layered challenge
Yeah.
where the person isn't just dealing with the inherent difficulties of autism, but they're also dealing with these extra burdens and costs,
Yeah.
simply because they're living in a world that doesn't fully get them or support their needs.
Exactly. And that's something that we as a society really need to start paying attention to and addressing.
So thinking back to what we were talking about before, I can see how this autism tax could contribute to that feeling of isolation and distrust. It's like this constant reminder that you're different, you don't quite fit in, and the world isn't always on your side.
That's right. And that's why it's so important to create more awareness and understanding about autism, to really challenge those social norms and expectations that create this tax in the first place.
So what can we do? How can we as individuals and as a society start to ease the burden of this autism tax?
Well, I think it starts with education. The more we understand about autism, the more we can create spaces and environments that are truly accepting, supportive, and inclusive.
And it needs to go way beyond just the basics.
Right.
It's not enough to just know the definition of autism. We need to understand how it shows up in different people, how it affects their lives,
Yeah.
and what kind of support they need to thrive.
You got it. And it's not just about that formal education in schools or workplaces either. It's about those open and honest conversations that we have with our friends and family, sharing our experiences, and challenging those misconceptions that are out there about autism.
It's about creating a culture of empathy and understanding, where neurodiversity is seen as a strength, not a weakness.
That's beautifully said. And I also think we need to advocate for changes in the system, changes that can reduce the actual financial strain of the autism tax. Things like increased funding for research, better access to affordable therapy and support services, and workplace accommodations that can help people with autism to succeed in their careers.
Those are all great points.
Yeah.
It's about creating a world where everyone, no matter their neurology, has the opportunity to live a fulfilling life.
That's the goal. And I truly believe that with more awareness, empathy, and action, we can make that happen.
Speaking of action, the Cheap ABA blog also stresses the importance of self-advocacy, speaking up for your own needs and challenging people who might underestimate or misunderstand you.
Self-advocacy is absolutely crucial. It's about knowing your rights, setting boundaries, and being able to communicate your needs in a clear and assertive way.
And it's about recognizing that you deserve respect and dignity, no matter what.
Exactly. And sometimes self-advocacy means challenging the people who are spreading harmful stereotypes or misconceptions about autism.
I can imagine it can be really intimidating to speak up, especially if you've been conditioned to believe that your voice doesn't matter, or that you shouldn't make waves.
I totally get that. But it's important to remember that your voice does matter. Your experiences are valid. And when you speak up, you're not only empowering yourself, but you're also creating space for other people to do the same.
So it's about finding that balance between protecting yourself and advocating for your needs, knowing when to step back and when to step forward.
Exactly. And sometimes that means choosing your battles, knowing when to walk away from a situation that just doesn't feel safe or productive.
That's a great point. Self-preservation is so important. And it's okay to put your own well-being first. But when you do feel empowered to speak up, your voice can really make a difference.
It definitely can. Every voice adds to the chorus. And the louder that chorus gets, the more likely we are to create real change.
So we've covered a lot today. From the roots of skepticism as a trauma response, to the impact of the autism tax, to the power of self-advocacy. It's a lot to think about. But I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
I agree. There's always more to learn and explore. And I really encourage everyone listening to continue this conversation, seek out resources, connect with other people, and just keep learning.
And while we're on the topic of learning, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap things up. The Cheap ABA blog has quite a few posts about the challenges of dating and relationships, specifically for autistic adults. And I think that's something that deserves its own deep dive episode at some point. But for now, I'm just curious, how do you think skepticism plays a role in this area?
Oh, that's a great topic, and one that I think is often overlooked. And yeah, you're right, skepticism can definitely play a role in romantic relationships, both for the autistic individual and their partner.
So how might that skepticism show up in romantic relationships? What are some of the challenges that couples might run into?
Well, for the person with autism, that skepticism might make it difficult to trust their partner. or to really be intimate. They might have a hard time believing that their partner really loves and accepts them, especially if they've been hurt or betrayed in the past.
Just like that protective shield we were talking about.
But in this case, it's guarding their heart from being broken.
Exactly. And that can make it really hard for them to let go of those defenses and be vulnerable, which is so important for building a close and intimate connection.
And that could be frustrating for the partner, who might feel like they're always having to prove their love and that they can be trusted.
Absolutely. And that's why communication is so important. Both partners have to be willing to listen to each other, really try to understand each other's feelings, and work together to create that safe and supportive space where they can both be vulnerable.
So it's not about trying to fix the person with autism or force them to be less skeptical. It's more about understanding where that skepticism comes from and finding ways to build that trust and intimacy, even though there might be those challenges along the way. Exactly. And don't forget, every relationship is different. There's no magic formula or one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one couple might not work for another.
So it's about finding what works for you, being open to trying different things,
Yeah.
talking to each other honestly, and just continuing to learn and grow together.
You got it. I think that's a great place to leave things.
Me too. But before we wrap up completely, is there anything else you want to add? Any final thoughts or insights for our listeners?
Yeah, if I could leave everyone with one thing from our deep dive today, it would be this. Embrace complexity. Remember that autism is not a monolith. It's a spectrum. And every individual is going to experience it in their own unique way. So let's approach each other with curiosity and empathy, a willingness to learn. Let's challenge our own assumptions and biases, and work towards creating a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued for exactly who they are.
That's a beautiful message. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today.
It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into adult autism and the trauma of skepticism. We hope this conversation sparked your curiosity, challenged your thinking a little bit, and encouraged you to learn more about this important and fascinating topic.
Don't forget, this is just the beginning of the conversation. Keep exploring, keep connecting with others, and keep advocating for a world where everyone can thrive.
That's it for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep on learning and exploring.